Hello, here is the latest on Donald Trump's trade tariffs. Mexico has had theirs paused. Canada has escaped them too, temporarily, but they are now in place on all Chinese imports into the United States. China has retaliated, but not in a massive way, leading some people to think they've got a real strategy here. But what could it be? We will untangle that and investigate it further on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the fake newscast studio, but doing a real episode. And the second half of this episode, we're going to focus on the issue of fentanyl, which is the synthetic opioid that's responsible for lots of deaths from overdoses in the US and is the reason Donald Trump has given for applying lots of these tariffs to various countries' imports into the US, because he sees it as a way of getting them to clamp down on the supply of fentanyl, because they are important staging points in the global supply chain, which ends up in America. But first, we're going to get the latest on the tariff situation. Canada and Mexico have had their Trump tariffs postponed or paused after Trump had calls with their leaders and managed to extract things he wanted from them. But the 10% tariffs on all imports into the US from China are going ahead. And on Tuesday, China retaliated, but in quite a targeted way. So not whacking massive tariffs on everything from America, whacking not massive tariffs on some things coming from America, which has got some people thinking they've got a real strategy here. But what could it be? Let's dive into it and find out, because I'm joined now from Beijing by the BBC's China correspondent, Laura Bicker. Hi, Laura.
Hello, Adam. How are you?
So, Laura, just want to give us the basics of this story then. What American imports into China will get more expensive as a result of these new tariffs?
So yes, Beijing has decided to retaliate. So it's decided to implement 15% tariffs on liquefied natural gas, on coal, and a 10% levy on the likes of crude oil and large imported US cars. That will all take place on Monday, February the 10th. Now, that gives a little bit of time for these two leading economies to step back from the brink of this trade war. This is crucial because the measures that Beijing has implemented today are targeted and they don't have the same impact as the tariffs that the US has put on to Chinese goods. So Donald Trump has put a 10% levy on all Chinese goods. And yet China today has done a bit of a measured approach. So it's just very, very targeted. And when you speak to analysts, they'll say that it'll be about 30% of US imports into China. So it doesn't have any kind of equilibrium. So it may well be that Beijing is keeping that door open for some negotiations. And we know from the White House that there is a call scheduled between Donald Trump and President Xi.
And Cindy, do you buy into that theory that actually this is a bit of a symbolic action to prepare the ground for some negotiations and the real action will come as a result of that?
Yeah, I very much agree with that. One thing is that how quickly this package has come into play basically tells me that Beijing had something planned because they've been listening to Donald Trump throughout the campaign trail. They remember what happened in the last trade war. And so they've been thinking, okay, Trump's going to come in, do these tariffs. What are we going to do in return? And so we've had this package of measures that have come in pretty quickly, which tells me that Beijing has more up its sleeve because it will be anticipating that Trump will probably up the ante in the coming months. There are other parts of the package that are quite more symbolic as well. For example, this antitrust probe into Google, which the search engine is not accessible within China, but it provides Android software for Chinese phones. But it's also just, a stereotypical American company that China can then say, look, we're hitting the Americans as well as the owner of Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. So there are certain things in the package that says to me, this is a symbolic move so that Beijing can say, we're not backing down yet, but we're also not going to go completely nuclear. Let's talk.
And Laura, what more do we know about this investigation into Google? Like, what will they be looking at and what could they eventually do to Google?
Well, I think that is the real mystery because here in China, we're behind a Great Firewall. It's not like anybody on the street can then open their phone and use Google. It's just not something that many people here use unless you have a VPN, which helps you jump that firewall. So we're kind of in the bit in the dark about what this probe will be about. And I think that will be key as we look at in terms of the kind of thinking that Beijing has. But when it comes to these measures targeting businesses such as Google, I think what I've been hearing over the last few months is that Beijing was not going to go for a simple tit-for-tat response as it did during the last trade war. This time it wanted to kind of look at where it was going to target. And one of the reasons for this is because China sells far more to the US than it buys. So last time during the trade war, they actually ran out of things to impose tariffs on. So this time they might be more strategic, and that includes launching investigations into American giants such as Google.
And also, Cindy, I mean, this is a different Chinese economy that Donald Trump is having a go at now, isn't it? Compared to 4 years ago, compared to 10 years ago, compared to 20 years ago.
Absolutely. In some ways, the situation is better for China because after the first trade war, China began what's called a dual circulation strategy, which basically meant it was trying to be more self-reliant on its own supply chains, particularly in tech, for example, like companies like Huawei, which now primarily source from Chinese suppliers, not least because of American action. So in some ways, the Chinese economy is a bit more impervious to these measures. At the same time, the Chinese economy has also slowed in its growth. So the situation post-pandemic for China has not basically recovered compared to the first trade war. And so, to Laura's point, there are fewer things that China could retaliate with. And China's economic strength is also less than what it was before.
And Laura, we've been talking a lot over the last few days and the last few weeks that Donald Trump is using tariffs in a non-traditional way. Normally, you use them to change the flow of trade between two countries, normally to protect your homegrown industries from competition from abroad. But actually, Trump is now using tariffs as a tool to get something from his trading partners. What is he trying to get from China this time round? And is that actually what we think he's trying to get, or is he just using that as a pretext?
Well, China has had this before. They've learned from the Trump administration of 2017. And when you say that he's using this as a diplomatic tool, well, that's how Beijing felt last time around. This time around, what does he want? Look, we've had so many things bandied around from very many analysts. I think one key thing that I have noticed over the last few weeks is this theory that Donald Trump wants President Xi's help to end the war in Ukraine. And that is because during a couple of interviews and during a speech that he made to Davos, he's mentioned that China could help with that, and China has significant sway when it comes to Russia's Vladimir Putin. So that's one theory. There are other things that Donald Trump may want from China, and that includes maybe perhaps more access, more US businesses getting access to Chinese markets. It may also be looking at whether or not there's a deal to be done on various access to, for instance, when it comes to the South China Sea. Certainly that's from China's point of view. They may want US posturing to stop near Chinese waters. These are the kind of things that could be to and fro and on the negotiating table. Make no mistake, any kind of deal negotiation or whatever, or talks between Washington and Beijing, it will not be the same as with Canada and Mexico. This will be a very, very difficult negotiation. What we don't know, and this is one thing that an analyst brought up with me today, is has there been negotiations before this point? Because Beijing's response was incredibly muted. Yes, it's been Chinese New Year. It is still Chinese New Year. But Beijing's response right up until today has been incredibly muted. So do they know that there could be negotiations in the offing? And are they certainly, have there been negotiations going on? So that's something that we don't know. We know that there is a call later this week, so there may be a deal to be done. But what will Donald Trump want, and will President Xi give it to him? And that could be long and it could be protracted. And I think that's what many businesses and certainly the markets might be worried about.
And Cindy, we've sort of been talking as if Donald Trump is picking up from where he left off last time he was president. But actually, he's kind of picking up where Joe Biden left off, because Joe Biden picked up from where Donald Trump left him the first time round.
This is a very unpopular point to be making in some quarters of American discourse, Adam, because, the Democrats want to say that they're very different than the Republicans. But yes, you're absolutely right. Biden continued a lot of Trump's approach on China with the CHIPS Act, for example, the export controls on the most advanced chips into China. The news from DeepSeek last week shows that might not have worked as well as they hoped it would. Also on the Inflation Reduction Act, which basically tries to cut out Chinese renewable suppliers from the green supply chains of basically the world. What differentiates Trump's approach, though, is that he is just so blanket about everything. Biden was always trying to be very targeted, justifying things in strategic industries. Trump is just putting 10% on everything. And what he wants to get out of it is not necessarily clear, hard power either. To Laura's point about, what are the political goals that he's trying to achieve here? Biden, I think you can see him as trying to contain China as a threat, as a challenge to the American superpowerdom. But with Trump, it might be a bit more pragmatic than that. He doesn't really care about, for example, Democrats in Taiwan. He doesn't really care necessarily about Taiwanese independence. He wants to know, are American troops going to be deployed in Taiwan? We need to get to that stage. So it might be that some parts of this deal is not actually what we traditionally in the West think of when we think of protecting the West from China, in the sense of what Trump's priorities are, as we have seen with his dealings throughout with these other allies as well, is very, very much America first.
And Laura, you mentioned that it's Chinese New Year, which people are celebrating on a massive scale. Do you get the sense that Chinese families are moving away from their Chinese New Year celebrations to go and watch TV and listen to the radio and click on whatever websites they can get to read about what Donald Trump is doing to China?
Absolutely not. It's not even been headline news here in China. Actually, they've been looking, and certainly the headline on much of Chinese social media has been about a Taiwanese actress who has sadly died from the flu. So I think when you kind of look at what is a priority to Chinese state media, they've not made this one of their key kind of news headlines. Now, that may be because certainly the Chinese state media don't want to worry a population that is already slightly concerned about its own economy. What they're trying to do here in China is get people to spend money. Fears of a trade war would make people save it. So I think when it comes to trying to sow the seeds of fear into the population, that's maybe why those headlines are not quite there. From the average Chinese perspective, they look with curiosity over at Donald Trump. They see this political pendulum swinging in America every 4 years. And they look at it with both a little bit of intrepidation, but really just with curiosity. Remember, here they see and feel that this is a stable government. And many people will look at America and wondering what's going on. But from Beijing leaders' perspective, what Donald Trump is doing when he is threatening tariffs to Canada, Mexico, and now the EU, he will be basically alienating traditional US allies. Now, if you're a leader in Beijing, if you're President Xi and you're watching this, especially as he's made no secret of his ambitions to be the leader of a new world order, you're looking at this and wondering, is this an opportunity for China to step in? You're watching America withdraw from parts of the world in terms of, US aid. China may decide it wants to, develop its aid program, especially perhaps its loan program through Belt and Road Initiative. So from President Xi's perspective, from Beijing's perspective, what is happening in America is, one, a curiosity, and perhaps for its president, an opportunity.
Well, yeah, and I remember towards the tail end of my time in Brussels, which I seem to be talking about a lot this week, it's almost like we've got a big anniversary coming up. One of the big things that they've been working on in Brussels was a trade and investment deal with China, which, Cindy, Joe Biden came in and told the EU to pull. So that's an example of how actually, even fairly recently, people were like deepening their ties with China. It's not just all been like pulling apart.
Yeah, that's true. Although the European Parliament, even at the time, as you know, Adam, was very anti that deal. But I think what this raises is a question of how do the countries in the middle calibrate between these two giant states having this big argument. If you are Canada or the EU or the UK, what is it that you're meant to do to A, survive, B, to maximize your national interest? It is really, really tricky. And I think there's a bit of schadenfreude in the UK this week because of that long phone call that Keir Starmer had with Trump, because of the fact that Trump earlier in the week said that UK was out of line, but at least, I think something can be done there. Everyone's looking around at each other and thinking, God, are we next? What can we do about it in the meantime? And, part of the unpredictability of Trump's approach is that he risks driving a lot of these powers in the middle towards China in a way that the trend was definitely getting away from China under Joe Biden. Now, is that a good, brinksmanship strategy to make the EU, for example, pay more into NATO? Or would that actually just, drive a wedge between the US and its Western allies? We simply don't know at the moment. But it certainly is brinksmanship. He's pushing his allies to the maximum to say, you've got to pick a side, and he's betting that they will pick the Americans.
So we didn't talk about it there with Cindy and Laura, but one of the big stated reasons, in fact, the main stated reason Donald Trump has given for applying tariffs to China and trying to apply tariffs to Mexico and Canada is because those three countries are involved in various stages of the production and transport of this synthetic opioid called fentanyl, which is a huge topic of conversation in the US, much less of a conversation topic in the UK because the drug is not consumed in nearly the same quantities here. So I wanted to find out a bit more just about why fentanyl is such a big deal, and also to just kind of get a mental map of how Canada, Mexico and China fit into it. So somebody who knows that really well because he spent years going undercover, investigating and then writing about it for his book Fentanyl Inc. is the investigative journalist Ben Westhoff, who's here on Newscast. Hello, Ben.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on Newscast. So before we dive into kind of like the global web around this substance, what actually is fentanyl and where did it originate? Who invented it in the first place?
Fentanyl was invented as a hospital painkiller and has been used for decades in procedures like open heart surgery. It's a very important medical drug, but it's only in the last 10 years or so that it's jumped into the illicit realm and is used as a drug of abuse.
And what is it about American drug-taking habits or trends that means its use has just skyrocketed?
Fentanyl is piggybacked on the opioid epidemic, which started with the overprescription of pills like OxyContin, and which were mismarketed as non-addictive, basically. And so when people had an injury, they were prescribed these pills, their pills ran out, many of them turned to the black market, and they started using fentanyl from the streets. Eventually, the market sort of overtook the heroin that was available, and fentanyl rushed in to fill the void.
And people take it as pills.
Well, fentanyl can be as a fake prescription pill that looks exactly like an OxyContin or a Xanax or a Percocet. It can also be a powder. There's lots of different ways to take it, but it's the bottom line is that only the tiniest little dose is enough to have someone overdose and die.
And just give us a sense of the size of the problem in the States.
It's the worst drug epidemic in U.S. history. In fact, some people are saying it's the worst drug epidemic in world history. It wasn't that long ago that there were maybe 2,000 Americans a year dying from drug overdoses. And then it's recently got up over 100,000. So.
And have there been particular moments that have kind of seized the nation's attention and made people realize what a problem this is?
There's so many celebrities who have died of fentanyl. I mean, you had the rock stars Prince, Tom Petty, a lot of famous rappers, actors, Michael K. Williams from The Wire, Coolio. I mean, it almost seems like every week you hear about another famous celebrity who died from fentanyl.
And is it so widespread amongst kind of everyone else that most people will know somebody or know somebody who knows somebody who's either taking fentanyl or has died from an overdose? Is it kind of that prevalent?
Yeah, I mean, you talk to anyone really, and they're likely to know someone whose family has been affected by fentanyl. I had a very close friend die back in 2010, and that sort of is what started me on my quest to learn about the drug and write my book, Fentanyl Inc.
And talking about your quest, I mean, that took you to lots of different places around the world because, as I was saying a minute ago, there's a global web of this drug that ends up in the United States.
Yeah, all of the raw ingredients for fentanyl are made in China. And so I went undercover pretending to be a drug buyer into some labs in China that were making fentanyl and fentanyl precursors. And I really got to understand, the drug traffickers there are not like Mexican or other drug traffickers with AK-47s. These are scientists and, businessmen who are oftentimes operating legally under Chinese law, and yet they're the ones kind of fueling this epidemic.
And how is it that they're operating legally if the product they're producing is so dangerous?
Well, China has kind of slowly cracked down, banning fentanyl and these different types of fentanyl called fentanyl analogs, but still legal are a lot of the fentanyl precursors, which are basically the most important ingredients needed to make fentanyl. And so these companies sell these precursors to the Mexican cartels who make fentanyl the rest of the way, and then they send it north across the border into the United States.
And it's interesting reading about these factories in China because either they can make the case that they're making products that become ingredients for something else that's completely legitimate, and also you hear about that they can actually sort of change their production lines really quickly. So if someone comes looking, the factory can just look much less suspicious really quickly.
Yeah, sometimes these factories will be making something totally legal and benign in the daylight hours and switch in the nighttime hours. The biggest problem is that they just don't have the enforcement in China. Even the laws they have on the books, they don't have the boots on the ground to stop it. Also, a lot of this stuff is being sent directly through the mail. And so, it's very easy to mislabel something as a different chemical, a legal chemical, a safe chemical. And trying to stop it from getting into the US is kind of a needle in a haystack approach because there's such a high volume of mail coming from China already.
Tell me what it was like when you went undercover in the factories posing as a buyer. Just what was that like?
I had to tell a whole story. I had to pretend, basically. I actually said that my friend was the drug trafficker, and I just happened to be in China scoping out the place. And I said, if you let me see your lab and it passes our quality expectations, then he'll make a big order. And so this guy kind of vetted me for the whole morning, and he asked me directly if I was a journalist. I had to, make up this whole story, put on my acting skills, but eventually he allowed me to come, and it looked kind of like a high school chemistry lab, really. I mean, if you've seen the show Breaking Bad, it was a fairly, high quality, sort of well maintained lab. The smell was very powerful, and he showed me where they were making all these fentanyl products, also something called synthetic cannabinoids, sometimes called K2 and spice, which are another big problem. And eventually, he asked me if we were gonna make a buy, and I said I would get back to him. So I got out of there by the skin of my teeth.
I know that President Biden talked a lot about this and took a lot of action, and President Trump in his first term took a lot of action. Is there anything that's happened up till now that sort of worked, that's helped to tackle the trade?
Well, during Trump's first term, that was the first kind of trade war where he threatened to increase all these tariffs against China, and did. And he demanded that China take action against fentanyl, and they actually did. They banned what are known as fentanyl analogs, these different types of fentanyl that were technically still legal. And so President Xi banned fentanyl analogs, and so people thought that was great at the time. Unfortunately, all these companies making them just shifted to the fentanyl precursors. And so now what Trump is asking for is for China to really crack down on the companies making these fentanyl precursors. And he's betting that because threatening tariffs worked last time, that threatening tariffs will work again this time.
And is there something the Chinese authorities could convincingly do, or is it actually just the reason they haven't necessarily done it or succeeded is because it's a bit of a whack-a-mole problem. It's an unsolvable problem ultimately.
Well, I think as a totalitarian country, there's more China can do. They One thing that America would like China to do is these companies selling fentanyl precursors. There are legitimate uses for these, right? Like I said, fentanyl is an important hospital product, but making sure that the buyers in Mexico are legitimate. You know, almost all of the cartels, they have these front companies, and so they buy these fentanyl precursors, and really they're just going to be made into drugs. But America would like China to make sure these companies are only selling to legitimate hospital fentanyl providers and not just drug company fronts. And that should be something that should be enforceable.
Although to me, that sounds like that's not a problem that's solved by putting 10,000 Mexican troops on the border, which is what seems to have led Trump to pause his tariffs on Mexico. It sounds like that's a much more domestic law enforcement thing for the Mexican government to do rather than the very visible sending the troops to the border.
I agree. I don't believe that beefing up security at the border is really going to do anything. Fentanyl is so powerful and so small, the way it works, that 1 million doses can fit in a briefcase, right? And so what I would say is that we can't stop drugs from getting into prisons. You know, you hear about prisoners overdosing and dying all the time, and that's a maximum security environment. So there's no way to stop drugs from getting into this country. It's going to find a way. And what we need to do instead is focus on addicted users and helping them beat their addictions.
And Canada, how does Canada fit into this picture in terms of the supply?
A lot of fentanyl comes through Canada. There's a lot of drug laundering, fentanyl trafficking. Some of it comes through the northern border with the United States. And there's a lot of Chinese gangs actually that are clandestinely making fentanyl in Canada, and then they're laundering their money through real estate in places like Vancouver. So Canada plays into the whole fentanyl epidemic as well, and Canada has its own problem too, with people overdosing and dying. Canada and the United States are the two countries that have this big problem.
So Donald Trump does have a bit of a point when he says Canada's involved in this too. That's not just bluster or an excuse to have a go at Canada.
I think the vast majority of fentanyl comes through the southern border with Mexico and the United States, but a lot of fentanyl trafficking, but a lot of fentanyl production does occur in Canada, and I think that's more likely to maybe come through the mail.
You were giving evidence to a congressional committee last spring. I just wondered, what was it like being right in the kind of political center of this crisis?
Unfortunately, politics, screws up everything, and both the Democrats and the Republicans were talking so much about more border security, more troops, more technology to stop getting fentanyl across the border. But really, the problem was that we need to focus on the addicted users. The people most likely to die from fentanyl are people who have been addicted for years, if not decades. And it's not just heroin, with fentanyl cut into it, but fentanyl is often cut into cocaine, meth, prescription pills. And so really, you can't get pure drugs in the United States at all anymore. And someone might have had a cocaine addiction for years and years, but now there's fentanyl in it and they overdose and die. And so we need to educate these users, and we need to provide them with treatment drugs. There's very good treatment drugs out there that are FDA approved. It's just that the majority of addicted users don't have access. There's one I'm doing a documentary about called naltrexone, which is basically a vaccine for opioids. It's like a force field to protect you, but almost nobody is receiving it.
And is that it costs too much issue, or it's a moral issue where people feel it's helping somebody who's potentially going to do a bad thing? As far as a certain chunk of society sees it.
Yeah, there is plenty of funding for naltrexone and these other treatment drugs. It's just the problem is that people don't know they're available, and there is a moral component to it too. People say, well, you got to use your strength, your courage. It's a moral failing. You got to do this by yourself. When really, medication is the key to beating opioid addictions.
And why is it that some countries like the UK, for example, just don't have this problem? It's just not here to the same extent.
Fortunately for the UK and Europe, you never had a bad opioid crisis based on these prescription pills in the first place. And that's what's fueled the problem in the US and Canada. And so, we had and still have very lax advertising laws. So major pharmaceuticals are always being advertised on TV. And actually, since Purdue Pharma, who made OxyContin and mismarketed it, all the stuff they did is basically still legal in the United States, which means we could see another problem like this.
Oh, and actually, just before you go, is it true that the fentanyl pills, they're actually really, really cheap to buy?
Yeah, fentanyl is incredibly cheap on the streets. Places like San Francisco, kind of the center of the epidemic, and it's like $5 a dose to get fentanyl on the street. So it's really crazy.
Yeah, you can see why it took off. Ben, thank you very much, and thanks for all your many years of going undercover and speaking to scary people on our behalf. So thank you.